Okay, welcome everyone. We are about to read an interesting article about a very interesting little bit of midrash that arises out of the Torah, and the the background or the story is the Joseph story. And interestingly, the Joseph of many color dreamcoat variety. Um, so the Joseph story is the longest single narrative in the Torah. I don't know if it's the longest single narrative in the Bible, but it certainly is the longest single narrative in the Torah. And interestingly, it's also the longest single narrative in the Quran. Um,
Hmm.
for those of you who may not be so familiar with the Quran, there are many biblical stories that are actually in the Quran, and of course they can have a slightly different take on them than we see in the Bible. And there are also certainly references to the New Testament and New Testament figures like Jesus and Mary and so in the Quran, for example, Jesus is acknowledged as Messiah, but not acknowledged as God. So that's another sort of interesting subject. Um, and so one of the things I did a long time ago, I think I did it once on Zoom, but I'm not sure, was to read the Joseph story in the Quran and the Joseph story in the Bible side by side. And I think we did it live. That might be something that's fun to do to see the different period kinds of emphasis. But one of the things I noticed in the Quran's version of the Joseph story is um, basically, and the subject of our article tonight is, I think well, let me just review very quickly. I was thinking of maybe reading it from the text, but basically, as you know, Joseph is first, his brothers are going to murder him, and then he's actually saved and thrown into a pit. And one of the brothers says, is thinking, oh, I'll just release him when the other brothers go away. But then along comes a group of people, and in one line, they're Ishmaelites, and I think in another line, they may be Midianites. No, I can't actually remember. But anyway, they are sold. He is sold into slavery in Egypt, and he is sold into the house of Potiphar, who is apparently he's a saris, which interestingly in biblical Hebrew can mean like an official in the government of Egypt, and it can also mean a eunuch, which is actually a really interesting possibility.
Yeah.
Because I'll just digress here for a moment. In this book of Esther, she's waited upon by eunuchs, and they use the term saris uh, for uh, for the eunuchs. So the question is, and you won't hear everybody phrase it exactly like this: why is Mrs. Potiphar so horny? Um, and one answer is her husband's a eunuch. Uh, Another answer is Joseph is irresistible. So that's by way of introduction. We're not going to go to the eunuch side, although that might be some interesting midrash to review. I bet it's in there. Um, so basically, Joseph gets sold as a slave, a house slave, into Potiphar's house, and he does really really well. He's very smart, um, and Potiphar basically gives him more and more responsibility until just about everything, as we'll see, is under his command. And things are going really great until Mrs. Potiphar uh, keeps begging him to sleep with her, and he refuses. And one day she begs him again, and he refuses, and tries to run away. And she grabs his clothing, and it's not clear how much clothing she has in her hand when he runs out. That's actually something else I think that gets discussed in this article. And um, so, to avoid being embarrassed, basically, she complains to her husband, Potiphar, that he tried to rape her. And so he is imprisoned. And then we have the rest of the Joseph story where he interprets dreams, and the Pharaoh finds out he's a good dream interpreter, and he interprets Pharaoh's dream, and he becomes basically prime minister of Egypt. So the issue here is a little midrash on how irresistible was Joseph. Why is it that Mrs. Potiphar could not resist Joseph? And I'll give you the quick overview, and we'll read it in detail. In the Quran, you have this story that Mrs. Potiphar, and she's actually given a name. Actually, here's a okay, here comes Joanne. I ought to do my screen share. Here we go. So I need to get back to see you all. Okay. So yeah, so here's an image that's actually from Quran art, because she's identified by a name which I would guess to pronounce Zuleika, wife of Potiphar. So as a illustration, she brings Joseph in while she's serving fruit to her friends. This is Mrs. Potiphar, and her friends are so taken with Joseph's beauty that they start cutting their hands with a knife that they're using to peel the fruit. You can see them peeling the fruit down in here. And they cut their hands, and they're so taken that they don't even notice that they're cutting their hands. And I remember reading that in the Quran and saying, this is so good, it has to be a Jewish midrash. And sure enough, I found it. But this article discusses it in great detail, and I think it is a fun article. This has actually never happened to me. I've never walked into a room of women that have been so taken with my beauty and irresistibility that they perked up and noticed, much less cut their fingers. So here we go. So the article's in Torah.com. If you like these things, you can subscribe to Torah.com. You'll get a whole bunch of Torah commentaries and articles every week. And it's great to see Joanne back with us, and not a hospital bed in your background, but you're home.
Thank you. Nice to be home.
Yeah. So would you like to begin reading for us?
Okay, sure. In Egypt, Joseph finds himself the most important of Potiphar's servants, and soon his master's wife turns her attention to him. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me."
Yeah, and the Hebrew is actually lie with me. It's shichva imi, which means lie down, to lie down. So the translation is quite literal.
Joseph refuses, explaining that his master, her husband, has been good to him, so how could he repay his master with this kind of treachery? But Potiphar's wife is undeterred. And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her.
Okay, and the nice thing about reading this online, which I have on my screen here rather than the PDF, is if you hover above the footnotes, they pop up. So yeah, so it refers to what I just mentioned. Joseph refused. He said to his master's wife, she's never named in the story in the Bible, in the Torah. So he says to his master's wife, look, with me here, my master gives no thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hand. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God? So that's the Torah text. So he's a good, upstanding fellow and is refusing. Alan?
So I just wanted to ask, she's not mentioned, not because she's an Egyptian, but because she's a woman, which is almost never mentioned in our own Bible, right?
Well, I don't understand the scope of your question.
You mean her name isn't mentioned?
Her name. If I can say, you made a couple of reference that we don't know Potiphar's wife's name that in the story, because women are not mentioned in our own. When I say our own, it's not because she's an Egyptian, though. It's because the Bible our patriarch authors.
Yeah. So it is always interesting and noteworthy when the Bible does mention the names
Right.
of women in general, and particularly Egyptian women. So can you think of any Egyptian women that are named in the text?
Hagar. I'll start with Hagar.
Yeah, Hagar is actually, I don't know if she's Egyptian. But anyway, she is definitely mentioned.
Yeah.
And then the midwives that saved Moses
Oh, for sure. Right.
are mentioned. Um, and I was just thinking of somebody else. Oh, and the woman that Joseph marries, who is Osnat, is named. Another important woman who is not named in the Bible is the Egyptian princess who saves Moses. It's actually another article that I may use here about that story. And the rabbis name her Batya, which means daughter of God, but the biblical text doesn't name her. There are some cases where men are not named, and when the men are not named, it's a put down. The one I always remember is in the book of Ruth. One of the relatives that has a claim to marry Ruth is called Ploni ben Ploni in the text, which is the Hebrew equivalent of John Doe. It's the insert name here. So I would say it's definitely true that women, because it's a patriarchal text, are named less often than men. And when they are named, it's something to keep your eye on. It seems like the Bible is going out of its way to call importance to that woman. So
There's
yeah.
The father of the five daughters.
Zelophehad.
He's named. Wait, he's
uh,
named. But there's a place in the Bible where it says that a man was killed because he was carrying wood on Shabbat, and that man is not named, but some people think it's him.
Oh, I hadn't come across that. I'm pretty sure the daughters are named.
Oh, they're all named. Yes.
Yes. So that's noteworthy, and they get a lot of recognition. So anyway, the story is in the Bible, Moses is doing his thing and issuing rules and commandments, and a man named Zelophehad has five daughters, and because the laws of inheritance don't allow daughters to inherit, so if you have only daughters, your inheritance would go to a brother or another male relative, and they believe that that's not fair, so they actually go to Moses. Moses consults God, and God agrees that it's unfair, and in effect changes the law. So they get a lot of kudos and credit from the rabbinic commentators, because they in effect are responsible for teasing out a mitzvah, a commandment from God.
I didn't mean to totally change the subject. It was more that the fact that some people think that when they say we died, our father died for his own sin, and some people have said that's him, that he's the one that got,
Yeah. So
violated.
that sounds like a classic midrash. When somebody is not named, the rabbis will try and figure out a reason why it ought to be this guy. And you'll see that, I think, in the discussion of midrash on this. It's a good article for identifying how things become midrash. Baruch.
Yes, just a real quick side note. The fruit they're cutting up is called a citron. It's like a lemon, but it has a very tough skin. And sometimes the women would cut the citron and cut themselves. So it's a very hard thing to cut. Just a side note, that's all.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. It makes sense. And of course, that's not in the Bible. It is in the Quran, but and also in the midrash. Alan, I assume you just haven't forgot. You forgot to take your hand down.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So, Farah, are you raising your actual hand?
Hi, do you have my voice?
I do have your voice, yes.
Yeah, oh, okay, thank you. I'm Pedra Payam's Minufar mother, and it's my first time. I'm glad that joined you guys.
Great.
But in Iran that we read, always they said Joseph and Zolecha. It was the name
so
was
there it is, Zolecha.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and is this a Jewish source or a Muslim source that you talk about?
Maybe either one. I don't know exactly
So I
which
actually
source
don't
it
know.
is.
And are you Jewish or are you Muslim?
No, I'm Jewish. I'm
Okay,
Payam's
but
mother.
okay, but you hear the Zuleika from other Jews, right? I mean, it's not that you, or you're not sure.
Yeah, maybe it's
Okay,
from the other
okay,
one. Yeah, okay,
okay.
it might
Yeah,
be.
but it makes perfect sense because I don't know that she's identified by name in the Quran, but in Muslim commentaries, I think she's identified by name.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
okay. So I think we read up to here. That
Yes, right.
okay. So
Okay.
we're up to then one day.
Right. Then one day, when the two of them are alone in the house, she tries to force him, and he ends up running away naked.
Hang on a second. Let me see. Yeah. So here's the text. Actually, the text is both in Hebrew and English. One such day, he came to the house to do his work. None of the household being there inside, they're alone. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside.
This leaves her both vexed and in an awkward position of possibly afraid of a scandal. She calls out to her servants and claims that Joseph attempted to rape her and only ran out of the house when she screamed.
So again, we have the text. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside." Yeah, that's what we just read.
The biblical account has little sympathy for Potiphar's wife and presents her obsession with Joseph as a dark secret. She whispers in his ear. She waits to strike when the house is empty. Even her accusation against Joseph can be interpreted as her desire to keep suspicion away from her.
One of the things, and I can't remember if it's discussed in this article, but we don't have many references, certainly in the Torah, to people being beautiful, either men or women. I think Joseph may be the only man that's identified, and we'll see the actual language used in this way. So now we're going to start getting into various.
David, in the David story, she is described as beautiful.
Yeah, I think that.
Taking a bath, and she was beautiful.
And Rachel, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are some, more often women than men. Yeah. Thank you.
Just like in our lives now, more often women's beauty gets mentioned than men's.
I have a question. Why are so many women obsessed with Joseph?
That's the question we're going to read. Okay.
Why is that?
Okay. We're going to read the article. So
In
early
Joseph,
midrashic motif.
okay. In Joseph and Asenath, a Greek
I
Jew-
actually think it's Osnath.
Osnach?
I think so.
Okay. In Joseph and Osnach, a Greek Jewish text from Hellenistic Egypt, all Egyptian women are obsessed with Joseph. When he is in the house of his future father-in-law, Potiphar, he notices the man's daughter, Osnath, peering at him through the window. Joseph's reaction expresses his nervousness.
Let me just point out, I think that's the proper pronunciation. Maybe it's not the Greek pronunciation. This is very early. So Hellenistic Egypt, 100 BCE to 100 Common Era. So this would be very early Midrash. Most Midrash and Talmud are several hundred years later. And one of the things we in the story that we're reading, the master of the house is named Potiphar. But as we read further on, we read about the woman that Joseph will marry, who is Osnath. I should actually check that pronunciation in the text. And she is the daughter of Potiphar. And so the question is, are Potiphar and Potiphar the same person? And they might be. And in this midrash, they are. And so Joseph is working in the household of Potiphar, and his wife, is attracted to him. but he will turn out marrying Potiphar's daughter. So that's where they're going. And let's actually read this midrash from Joseph and Osna.
All the wives and daughters of the notable men and satraps of all the land of Egypt used to annoy him, desiring to sleep with him. And when all the wives and daughters of Egyptian men looked at Joseph, they used to suffer horribly because of his beauty.
I believe the word satrap means officers. I've seen that before in other biblical texts. Okay, but
Joseph repeatedly scorned them and the envoys whom the wives regularly sent to him with gold, silver, and costly gifts. Joseph consistently sent them away with threats and insults because Joseph repeatedly said, I will not sin before the Lord, the God of my father Israel, nor before my father Jacob.
Okay, let's see what the reference is. So this is the reference to the translation. So far, Baruch, I don't have an answer for you as why
I don't either. I don't know
so
why
beautiful,
that
but
would
let's
be.
just assume we're talking about, I don't know, you pick the most beautiful guy you can think of. And that's Joseph, but with abs.
Wow, amazing.
And the women have their husbands bring gifts of gold, silver, costly stuff, and he sends them away. He will not commit adultery because these are presumably married women.
As already noted by scholars of Midrash and Second Temple literature, the claim that Egyptian women stared at Joseph comes from one possible translation of a verse in Jacob's blessing of Joseph. A fruitful son is Joseph, a fruitful son to put an eye upon. The daughters step up to look.
So here, well, let me just point out, we'll take a look at that footnote in a second. And here in Genesis 49, basically, Jacob, I don't know if he's on his deathbed, but he's in the last days of his life, and he's commenting about each of his sons. And so this is his comment about Joseph. And it's Ben Porat, and Ben Porat can be translated in a couple of ways. Let's see what the footnote says.
Rabbi,
Hold on a second. So here's another translation. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The Midrash, however, understands banot as ayin, as in eye, as opposed to spring, daughters and girls, as opposed to branches, and sure as the verb to look. So they're playing with the translation, and just to understand the translation a different way. What you see over here, Joseph is a wild ass by a spring, wild colts on a hillside. That is a more common translation. So, I often comment how playing with the Hebrew and understanding Hebrew in different ways can completely change the meaning of the text. We know that Joseph is good to look at because of what Potiphar's wife gets involved in. So here is a hint of the fact that he is beautiful if you are flexible with your translation. Erwin, you were going to ask a question.
yes, I have two questions, Rabbi. First of all, in the beginning of the Joseph story, the brothers were jealous of him because he's always pampering himself, and he was very good looking.
I think that's probably, I think you're reading Midrash here. The brothers are jealous because he's Jacob's favorite son.
Well, and the other thing is, how could Jacob know that he is such a good looking when different part of the Torah says that Jacob lost his he had no very good eyesight.
Yeah, that was only, I think, in his very last days. But the midrash that I always think of in this is Joseph and Benjamin are the only two sons of Rachel. And Rachel was the love of Jacob's life. Remember, he wants to marry Rachel.
Yes.
His father-in-law switches brides on him, and he winds up with Rachel's sister Leah. And then Jacob also has children with two maidservants, but Joseph and Benjamin are the only two born children of Rachel. And the Midrash says that Joseph and probably Benjamin looked like Rachel, so that that may have well been the special connection between Jacob and Joseph, because Rachel dies, as you may recall. Anyway, but it is interesting to speculate on that. Okay, let's see with Genesis Rabbah. When you see Genesis Rabbah, this Rabbah means great. This is the great Midrash. It's called Midrash Rabbah, and there are 10 chapters in Midrash Rabbah, 10 books actually, one for each of the 5 books of the Torah, and then one for each of the 5 Megillot scrolls of in the writings in the Bible. So let's see what Genesis Rabbah has to say about this. So let's pick up right here, Joanne.
Genesis Rabbah glosses this phrase by explaining who the unnamed daughters are. The daughters step up to look, for the Egyptian princesses wished to see Joseph's face, but he did not turn his eyes onto any of them, and thus he inherited 2 worlds, since he did not fantasize about any of them.
Okay, let's see. The rabbinic expression this is a rabbinic expression meaning to succeed in the world of the living and being granted a share in the afterlife. So in rabbinic language, you may run across the phrase olam hazeh and olam haba. Olam hazeh means this world. Olam haba means the world to come. So as a reward for not being tempted by these daughters, the Egyptian princesses, he's rewarded both in this world and in the world to come.
The fragmentary Jerusalem Targum has the women pegging him with their jewelry to get him to look up.
Wow.
The daughters of kings and rulers would peer at you from the windows and gaze upon you from the walls, and they would throw bracelets, rings, and necklaces at you, and stare at you with the hope you would lift up your face and look upon one of them.
Whoa.
See what this. Okay, so he's explaining his translation. So you see the word Targum. The word Targum, I think that's an Aramaic word, means translation. And basically, you have a number of surviving translations of parts of probably Torah, possibly other books as well, into Aramaic. So I'm not, familiar with this specific Targum Yerushalmi Ketanim, a fragment, I guess. So there's another explanation. And again, you would think a Targum, a translation, would be like what we mean by a translation, which is to say, taking the Hebrew and translating it into another language. But in these ancient Targums, there's a lot of commentary, which go far afield from that than just the text. So my favorite example of that is in the book of Esther. We read about what was the first wife of the king?
Achashverosh.
Achashverosh, and what was his wife? Who was
Mama?
queen?
Esther, Vashti.
Vashti, right. So we read about Vashti, and in the text, it says the king called Vashti to come and appear before the men in her crown. So that's what the Hebrew text says. In the Aramaic translation or Targum, it says it was in her crown and only her crown. So basically, the king wanted to show her off, to have her dance naked in front of the men wearing only her crown. So
are we looking at an analogy?
Huh?
Are we looking at an analogy that's coming, or are we looking at an actual physical person?
What? On which subject? On
the daughters of kings and rulers would peer at you from the windows. And are we looking at an analogy of this man, or just?
We are looking at a midrash.
Midrash.
So the question is, very important question: how much of any and all of this material do you take literally?
Right, exactly.
How much of any or all of this material do you take seriously?
Right,
And what of it do you completely ignore because it's nuts?
really.
Okay, those
That's right.
are my three levels of interpretive fealty. So, I talk about this a lot in just connection with the Bible. So, do I believe these stories of the Bible actually happen the way they are written? And my answer, and this will not be the answer you will get from your Chabad rabbi or other rabbis, is no. These are our sacred myths, and I take them very seriously. Sorry,
There are what? I'm sorry. There are sacred what?
myths, myths,
Oh,
as in mythology.
I see.
And
Myth.
by
Okay.
myths, I don't mean they didn't happen. I would mean they are sacred stories that explain our origins.
I see. Okay.
And so that's Bible. Now, of course, a traditional rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, Chabad rabbi, would say everything we read is literally true. So the story of Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar is true. And of course, the rabbis took it very seriously, and they sought to dig into the text and enrich it. And so the rabbis are just making up stories. I don't think even the tradition necessarily takes them literally. These midrashim, they are stories to explain, to help us understand what we're reading.
There you go. That's
I think,
that's
Rabbi,
Hold on. First Alan, then Erwin. Go ahead.
Okay.
You muted, Alan. Somehow you got muted.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that the Targum topic came up in some class I was in a while ago, and then I became aware that Sepharia actually has a whole treatment, and as they've described it as what you just said, Rabbi, that it comes from translations from Aramaic from the 2nd to the 6th century CE.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah, that if anybody, but I don't know when one wants to look it up. You know what I mean? It's a parallel to other texts, right? There's everything in there exists for
Yes.
other.
So I will show you something just for fun. Hold on a second. It is very traditional in the world of Judaism to have the Targums and read the Targums. Basically, my understanding is that in ancient times when they would read Torah at the synagogue, market days, and so on, most people didn't speak Hebrew; they spoke Aramaic. So just like if I was reading Torah in a synagogue, I might translate it into English. They would translate it into Aramaic. So I want to just show you, I don't know if you can see this. So the book I'm holding up, some of you are very familiar with it. This is the Chumash by Art Scroll.
Yeah.
Very, very traditional. And inside, here's a page, and again, I don't know how well you can see it. So this is Hebrew, and this is the Targum. It's probably Targum Unclos. If I go to the very first page, it'll identify it.
This is the first one that's listed under writings in Sepharia, Unclos.
Unclos, yeah. I think it's the best known and most complete. I'm just trying to see. Yeah, so again, your Hebrew may not. This basically says Unclos. So what I find fascinating about this book is there are three things on this page that are really fascinating. First, you have remember, this is for English speaking people, right? Because this is an English translation. So presumably the people who are buying this are not so terrific in Hebrew or Aramaic. But because it's so traditional, you have the Hebrew text, you have Unclos, the Aramaic translation, and then you have Rashi's commentary in Rashi's script, which is a form of italics, which is only about a third recognizable as Hebrew letters. But it's just, I find it fascinating that Art Scroll sees this as so traditional that they can't bring themselves to publish just a simple translation of Hebrew into English. They have to give you Anklos, which presumably most people who are buying this book are not so terrific in Aramaic, and Rashi and Rashi script, which I can tell you takes some work to be able to read. The Rashi script, well, at least it has periods on it, but there's no vowels. So anyway, it's a digression. But my point is, it was very traditional and is still traditional to this day to read the Bible, to read Torah certainly, with the Aramaic translation and with Rashi's commentary.
Is there any country or any people that speak Aramaic these days?
Yeah,
Are you asking, are there any countries? Or,
yes.
Or people that speak
yeah,
Aramaic?
there are,
these
I
days?
think, some places in Iran where
Yeah.
Aramaic is still
Yeah.
spoken, or Iraq, probably Iraq, not Iran.
Maybe Kurd people, Kurdish people.
I don't know. I know, I actually studied Hebrew with a woman who grew up speaking Aramaic, but her Aramaic would be very different than the Aramaic you would find in these texts. And of course, in our world of Judaism, the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish, is mostly Aramaic. A ketubah, the marriage contract, traditionally is written in Aramaic. Basically, it was the common language that most people spoke for many, many years, beginning before the time of Jesus and hundreds of years after the time of Jesus. Hebrew was basically a language of prayer and sometimes a language of commerce. But from what I understand, no one grew up speaking Hebrew. They would grow up speaking Aramaic or other languages. And it was only in the late 19th century that Ben Yehuda restored speaking Hebrew, and his son was the first native-born Hebrew speaker in 2,000 years. So
And today is the anniversary of adopting Hebrew and Ben Yehuda's, and so today is Hebrew Language Day.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
That's right. It's the anniversary of his birthday, right? Yehuda Ben is there.
Birthday it's based on him. It's either the day
yeah. So it was an interesting subject. Again, forgive the digression, but digression.
Could be. I'm sorry. Could be Aramaic something close to Armenian or
Aramaic. Aramaic is my understanding is Aramaic is certainly close to Hebrew.
Close to Hebrew.
The words are different.
Or Assyrian.
I don't know Assyrian, so this is not a world that I'm very knowledgeable about. But it was a very interesting question that the early Zionists faced when they were deciding many things, including what the flag of Israel should be, and also what language should be the language of Israel, because you have all these people in Israel, and they're speaking many different languages. And of course, the Zionists wanted to have one language for the state of Israel, for the Jewish state. And there were suggestions that it be German. There were suggestions that it be Russian. There were suggestions that it be Yiddish. And Ben Yehuda was obsessed with the idea that Hebrew needed to be restored and made the language. And of course, that's what succeeded. Okay. So we still have a little bit of time. Let's continue the theme.
The theme of Joseph's extreme attractiveness to Egyptian women was then developed into a kind of defense of Potiphar's wife in a new scene added to the story in Jewish and Muslim retellings.
Okay, so here we go. The knife trick, Midrash Tanhuma.
Midrash Tanhuma depicts Potiphar's wife as expressing her desire for Joseph in public among her fellow Egyptian women who could sympathize. Our sages inform us that one occasion the Egyptian women assembled and came to see how very handsome Joseph was. What did Potiphar's wife do? She gathered citrons and gave one to each woman, and she gave each of them a knife.
Hold on a second. Let's see what it says. So Mark Brettler, who's a scholar of Bible, suggested to the author that it's possible the texts are referring to a fingered citron. You can look this up. And the women are confusing the fingers of the fruit with their own fingers. Okay, that's sort of a,
Yeah, right.
Isn't it a story from Quran?
I'm sorry?
I think this is a story from Quran.
Yeah, that's what I said originally. It's actually in the Quran. It's not in the Bible, but it's in Midrash. So this is a Jewish Midrash Tanhuma.
Yeah, I heard it.
8th century, so the 900s. Okay.
I'm Iranian, so I heard a lot.
Well, yeah. So I would say in Iran, you're in a culture that is dominated by Islam. So people know Muslim stories. Just like I would say many of us living in this country know a lot of stories about Jesus and Mary and you know and so on. If you grew up in a Muslim country, you'd know a lot of Muslim stories. Okay, let's continue. Then she summoned
Joseph and stood him before them. When they saw Joseph's handsome countenance, they cut their hands. She said to them, "If this can happen to you, who see him only once, how much more so does it happen to me, who must look at him constantly?"
Poor Potiphar's wife. This guy who is so handsome that people cut themselves just looking at him. When they just see him from afar, you know, serving dinner, and poor Potiphar's wife has to live with this guy. How is she supposed to help herself? Okay.
In this telling, Mrs. Potiphar's obsession with Joseph is quite public. She wants her peers to understand her love sickness and thus throws a party to show off his beauty. Like the previous motif, this too derives from a midrash, this time on the phrasing of Mrs. Potiphar's accusation against Joseph.
Okay, so we're going to get back to the biblical text.
When she saw that he left her in hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to play with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud."
So the thing we're going to focus on is this word us, banu, rather than if it was just play with me, it would be litzachek bi. And by the way, for those of you fond of Hebrew, you have the word sachek, which reminds us of the name Yitzchak. That's the same Hebrew root, and it's the word for laughter, but it also has a sexual connotation, and clearly here it's being used with a sexual connotation. He wasn't just a stand-up comedian to make Mrs. Potiphar laugh, but so let's see what the commentary is. The story of the women.
The story of the women, the citrons, and the knives explains why Potiphar's wife uses the word us and not me, even though in the biblical text she is accusing him of singling out her, not a group. In this midrashic scene, Potiphar's wife is speaking to the group of ladies who well understand the pressure she is under, even if she has reversed the attacker and the victim.
So let's see, a commentator raises the question, why is it here? There's nothing in the Bible to suggest this episode. He believes the Midrash Tanhuma text was an early Jewish expansion, but questions the inclusion of the citron and the knives. He believes it to be a later addition to an earlier text based on his understanding of the grammar. He also points out citrons featured in Tanhuma and Sefer HaYashar, which we're going to see below, are replaced by the generic word feast in other traditions. Kugel argues that a more concrete example like citrons and knives suggests a later text moving the story from generic to specific. But here is a great example of the role of midrash. So what they're arguing here is in the biblical text, Mrs. Potiphar says he had to bring a Hebrew to play with us, right? It's banu, rather than be. So that's one word. So the thing about midrash comes from the root of the verb, or the root for midrash is a verb liadrosh, which means to draw out. So what's going on classically in midrash is the stories aren't made up out of thin air. but the rabbis are focusing on something. So here the rabbis are focusing on the Hebrew to play with us. So who is us? So one way of explaining this phrase is they're imagining that she invited other women to see Joseph as well. But I would say we also see biblical stories that are expanded upon. There's a whole literature. The Red Tent is a great example of, I would say, one of the earlier and one of the best examples. Anita Diamant wrote a book called The Red Tent about the rape of Dinah. But for authentic midrash, there has to be something in the text which at least is a hook to bring you into the story. And so some modern midrash are just making up stories without that sort of linguistic connection. Okay, so
The story of the women, the citrons, and the knives explain why Potiphar's wife uses the word us and not me, even though in the biblical text she is accusing him of singling out her.
yeah, I think we read this.
I think we read that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we read the commentary. Okay.
All right. Sorry. All right. As shown recently by Mir Bar Elan of Bar, Elan University, this midrashic motif of the women cutting themselves when Joseph's beauty appears, already in Aramaic poems found in the Geniza, dating from the 4th and 5th centuries, and when the author of this midrash has
Whitfield.
translated and presented as a prose narrative.
Let's see. Okay, I'm not going to go into great detail on that. I just want to point out when they use the phrase the Geniza, a Geniza is a place that you store away old materials. So you're not supposed to erase texts or destroy texts by putting them in the shredder, putting them in the garbage, if they contain one of 7 names of God. And there is an example, and so the 2 things you can do with them is bury them in a Jewish cemetery, or put them away in a closet somewhere and let them turn to dust. And so the term for a place where you put these things is called the Geniza, and it's used all the time in traditional Jewish circles. And even at HUC, next to the copy machine, if you're making copies of things, and one of the things you're making a copy of is God's name, has God's name in it, and you don't want to use that copy because it didn't come out well, there were 2 big bins. One was conventional trash bin, and the other said Geniza on it, and presumably the college would just store it away. So there is this Geniza in Cairo, which because of some salt in the air and because it was extremely dry, had very well preserved texts. So a little over 100 years ago, they found this Geniza, and they found a treasure trove of documents, including apparently 4th and 5th century Aramaic poems, which have this idea about the knife story. And now we will go. Are you still okay reading, Joanne?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. So now we're going to read the story in the Quran.
All right. A very similar account also appears in the Quran in the surah about Yosef.
Okay. So surah is the chapter. As I mentioned, the story of Joseph, which in transliteration from the Arabic would be Yusuf, a very common name among Muslims. Quran is written in the 7th century, 600s, the same time that these midrashim are being written and appear. So here's the story in the Quran.
Some women in the city said, the wife of that mighty one has been trying to seduce her young man. He has affected her deeply with love. Surely we see that she is indeed clearly astray. When she heard their cunning gossip, she sent for them and prepared a banquet for them and gave each of them a knife. Then she said to Joseph, come forth to wait on them. When they saw him, they admired him and cut their hands and said, God preserve us. This is no mere mortal. This is nothing but a splendid angel.
Let's see what this is. Okay, so translation. Translations of the Quran go far and wide. They are much more diverse than translations, I would say, from Hebrew. Okay, so now we're going to read I don't know where the word ra'il comes from, but we'll see the Quran version.
The Quran version does not explain why the women had knives, but some of the traditional Muslim commentaries, such as the Persian author Abu Ashaq al-Balabai, who calls her Ra'il, explains they were cutting citrons and other fruit, and cut their hands with the knives, thinking that they were cutting the citrons and the other fruits. Qatada said they kept cutting their hands until they made them fall off,
No.
but they became aware only of the blood, yet experienced no pain from cutting off their hands because their minds were preoccupied with Joseph.
This is, again, I think explaining or giving the reference for this commentary. So this is a commentary on the Quran. And so just like we have commentaries on Torah, in the Muslim world, you have commentaries on the Quran.
Ra'il is also her name in the retelling of Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, where citrons are also emphasized.
Okay, now we're going to get to the word Zuleika that Farah mentioned. Oops.
Okay. Alternatively, most Muslim sources, especially from later periods, call her Zuleika. For example, Tafsir al-Kermani writes, when Zuleika learned of their criticism, she invited them for a repast. She handed a knife and a tangerine to each of the women and told them to slice it. The same moment she ordered Joseph to enter the gathering. When they saw the handsome Joseph, or if you want me to say
Yusuf, yeah.
Okay, all right. They could not discriminate between the fruit and their hands, and instead of the tangerine, they slashed their fingers.
Oy, oy, oy. No, that's impossible.
You're not a big fan of this, huh?
No, that's impossible. Why would women, what? The whole thing is not proper. It's not proper. I'm sorry. There's
Well,
another
I think what
answer
you're
to this.
saying, let me
There's
read.
another answer to this. They can't be doing that because
So
you can't cut off
hold
your
on,
own
hold on.
hands just because you
Baruch,
see a
Baruch.
handsome face.
Take a breath. I think what they're saying is, how is it that he was irresistible and they are providing implausible they are providing explanations which are great exaggerations.
Yes, they are.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's
So
exactly right.
so I would say that's as far as I would go. I wouldn't insult the text of the Quran or these things,
No.
but basically they're falling all over themselves to explain how fantastically handsome Yusuf or Joseph is. And, we can find all kinds of things that are equally implausible in the Bible. I'll just say, how is it the entire earth was covered with water in the story of the flood? And I say this as a physicist. If you have the ocean depth increase to the level where mountains are covered, because, physics says the ocean sea level is sea level, so the waters rose and covered everything. That implies an awful lot of water. And so where did it go? So, again, to me, it's a story that's not meant to be taken literally.
I don't think this is either.
And I would say,
how do you explain tsunamis when they cover 4 or 5-story buildings?
It doesn't cover the entire earth. A tsunami is a big wave.
But maybe
hold on a second. Big wave doesn't violate any laws of physics.
right. No, maybe it evaporated the Noah's Ark
But if it
water.
evaporated, where did it go? It would be in the clouds and it would rain.
Wait, I'm not done. It evaporated, and when it was up there, the angels grabbed it and spirited it away.
Oh, okay. Forgive me. I never thought of that very plausible and logical example. You'll forgive me that as a physicist, I have some problems with that, but that's just me.
But there is a question, as they say, when the Noah's flood came, everything was under the water. So how after that they find the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the grave, and that they are going over there in Israel, or they find these written things, the stories, everything should be destroyed.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand the reference. Baruch.
Yeah, to me, it goes like this. if a group of women would see a handsome man like 007, 007 when he was doing his stuff. 007, was a TV or a movie man.
Okay.
After a while, you stop thinking of him as a handsome man. You just think of him as a man. You don't attach the word handsome to him
I
anymore.
offer you two counter examples. Elvis Presley and the Beatles.
Yes.
Look at films of the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan or arriving at the airport, and people, young women, completely losing it.
Right.
Okay. So I don't know whether
Right.
they fell down and hurt themselves. And I would also offer that many men have been known to lose their better judgment in the presence of women.
Yes, they
I,
have.
of course, can't imagine this happening, but I have heard tell
Oh
that
my God.
that some even presidents and others and religious leaders and others can't
That's
see
political. Don't go on
themselves.
that political stuff.
No, I'm not being political.
Okay, go ahead.
I am talking about the power of sexual attraction.
Yes,
And
okay.
actually, Jewish tradition talks about this a lot. The
Yeah.
Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, and so anyway, so I think that power was well known and is well known, and I think they're playing upon that in these stories.
Wow.
So let's see, it's 7:59. Let's see if we can finish this section. It's not much more. Where are we? Well,
No, we go back, scroll back down, I mean.
yeah, okay.
Um,
Okay, you know what? Let's stop here. We'll continue with the discussion of Zuleika next time, and there's a kind of a long digression. It's a little technical in Sefer HaYashar. I'll look at it. I actually have some other articles about this phenomenon and Yosef and Joseph. I find this interesting, but in addition to just the substance of the story, I think as knowledgeable Jews and students of Judaism, it's important to understand the role of Midrash and where Midrash comes. And I know, Erwin often is certainly is a very knowledgeable Jew and often studies this material. And we went, but he often will talk about interpretations of the Bible and will raise Midrash as an example. And I think it's helpful to actually see how this works. And I just love this story because it's for the same reason it appalls Baruch. I love it. Sorry, Baruch. I'm going to call on Skona first and then Jim.
Jim raised his hand first, if that matters.
Go ahead.
Oh, he's asked a bunch of questions, so I'm going to call on you.
So have I. But anyway, the thing that I don't understand is that what she's trying to do is explain how she could, be so, because he's so beautiful. She's trying to explain her reaction, and she's successfully doing that. But what she's doing is accusing him of attacking her. So why does she need to explain why she attacked him when she says, I didn't attack him, he attacked me?
Yeah, so that's a very good question.
Yeah, really good.
And I'm not sure I have a good answer because in the Bible, in the biblical story, basically her defense is she attacked her. I'm sorry, he attacked her. A very simple defense. In these other stories in the Quran and in the Midrash, one of the explanations is people are gossiping about her that she really, was going after him. And so she's responding to that. So it's basically two defenses and they are incompatible with one another. I think that's an important point. And I would say we see that in Midrash all the time. There will be more than one explanation of something, and they will be incompatible with one another. Or the rabbis really have to strain to make them compatible. But you're absolutely right. in some ways, those are two defenses. And I would say, modern court of law, you might have people offering two defenses. Jim.
I'm really interested in your reaction to this because I think I've mentioned I have a friend who is a pastor of a Baptist Bible-based church, quite a literalist. And he was saying this whole Joseph story is not really about Joseph so much as it's about Judah. Because once the story's over, we really don't hear about Joseph ever again. He disappears into the pages of history. But Judaism comes from Judah. Jews come from Judah. And he's the one in the whole Joseph story who kind of comes out shining like the hero, like the one that saves the day. I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I think it is true that if you read the Joseph story carefully, and it's a long story, if we move past this episode, Joseph's in jail, and then he interprets dreams, and then he's made prime minister of Egypt. Meanwhile, back in Canaan, people are starving because of the famine that Joseph predicted and stored grain against. So the brothers go down to Egypt to get grain. And basically Judah has a long speech in connection with that story. It's actually the single longest speech of anyone in the Torah, where he basically offers himself as a surety to his father. I think it's Judah, that or maybe even to Joseph, and I'm a little confused. But basically Judah's a really good guy, and he perfectly undoes the sin that he committed earlier by standing up and being a good guy. He also does the same thing in connection with his daughter Tamar, when she has to play the prostitute to get Judah to comply with Jewish law. Once he is confronted with the crime that he's committed, which is not giving her to his son, his third son, he admits that she's right and he's wrong, and that son will actually be the son that she has will be in the line of David. It's a very interesting element of that. So so I would say certainly Christianity is obsessed, maybe obsessed is too strong a word, with Judah, who I think in Greek is Judas, and that casts another light on the whole story. So there's a lot of connections going on there. Cheryl and then Baruch.
Yes, but Judah.
We got Skona. Yes. Okay.
Yes, but Judah also has sex with her, and at first wants to deny it until she has his garments, and then shows it to him.
Yeah. So he doesn't actually deny it. He learns that his daughter-in-law, who has been married to his two older sons, and they both die. And now, according to the laws, basically it's Levirate marriage, he is obligated to give her to his youngest son, but she's got a lousy track record with his sons and their health, so he doesn't want to do it. So she tricks him into having sex. He doesn't know he's having sex with his daughter-in-law. She dresses up as a prostitute. He has sex with her, and he forgot to bring his American Express card. So he gives her his signet ring and staff or something, and then tries to go back and pay for it, but she's disappeared. And then he finds out that she's pregnant, and because she is technically betrothed to the youngest son, her becoming pregnant is an act of adultery for which she is to be put to death. And then she says to him, she shows him these things. And again, another thing that you see in Hebrew that you don't see in English, he says, Hakirna, please examine these. See if you recognize these. This is the same phrase that Joseph's brothers use to Jacob when they present the bloodied coat, Hakirna. So there's all kinds of things going on here. But when she shows him that you're the guy, you're the dad. He actually says, she's right and I'm in the wrong. So the one thing you can say about Judah is he knows how to repent from sins.
Yeah, like he
admits the
didn't
sins.
know it was her that he was having sex with. This is like the same thing, did I get the right sister? Or, she was
Oh,
substituted. I
okay,
had
so
sex
that's
with her.
interesting. So you think he really knew?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think you are attributing a level of attention and distinction and erudition is the wrong word to us guys when we are in the presence of an attractive prostitute on the road to Timnah. And you're assuming
No,
that,
it can't be
oh
that.
gosh, you remind me of my daughter-in-law. My guess is that the blood flow to his brain may have been impeded
Oh my God.
by other elements, Cheryl, but I
No.
appreciate that you believe
Yeah, the
that
blood
we
flow is going somewhere else.
This is all, it's a horror. It's all gossip. It's all gossip. There's nothing more than gossip happening.
wait, I'm sorry. We are doing biblical interpretation.
Yes, but it means it's all gossip. Everybody believes the gossiping. Nobody believes anything more than that, and it's turning into something that really doesn't exist. Never existed. That's what I think.
You're talking about this specific story.
Yeah.
You're talking about Midrash. So you're saying Midrash is gossip.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
In this particular
yeah. So
case,
I would say, I understand your reference, but I would say Midrash is an attempt to explain elements of Bible that we otherwise don't understand. So let me just give you two quick examples. One, how is it that God knew that Moses was the right guy to become the leader of the Israelites? Okay? The Bible is completely silent on that. It's just Moses is walking along in the wilderness of Sinai. He comes across a bush, and it's a burning bush, and God speaks to him out of the bush. So the question is, how is it that God knew that Moses was the right guy? That's a question, right? And the Midrash answers that question. And there's a bunch of different answers. One answer is God noticed that when a little baby goat or lamb would run away from the flock, Moses would leave the flock to find this baby goat, which showed God what a caring shepherd he was, even for the least of the flock. God
exactly.
said, "Aha,
Yes.
this is
Yes.
a good guy." Okay, so that's a midrashic answer to a question that is left open in the Bible. So midrash seeks to fill in missing elements of the Bible. I don't know that it qualifies as gossip, because gossip are stories people tell about other people. These are stories that we are exploring in the Bible. So I've never heard that criticism. It's not to say it's a bad criticism. It's just I've never heard that. Now, what I would say is, reflecting on, I don't know whose friend, Alan's friend, was it Alan's friend who was a fundamental? No, Jim, who was the friend with a fundamentalist Protestant? So I would say one of the elements that created the Protestant Reformation was the problem Protestants had lots of problems with the Catholic Church. And, and there are many with good reason. One of them was the church shared something that we Jews do, which is to dig in and interpret biblical text. Right. So the church fathers are interpreting text just as we're doing tonight. We're interpreting the text. So one of the main elements of the Protestant, which means protest, that's what Protestant means, they're protesting. What are they protesting? Many things. One element is what has come to be known as sola scriptura, which is just solo, only scripture. Don't give me all of these stories and midrash and church fathers commenting on this and that and interpreting for us what they mean. Just give me the biblical text and I will interpret it. So, Jim, when you use that language, Bible-based I think that's what's going on here. They're just focusing on the biblical text. Of course, I find it interesting that they're focusing on a translation, and usually English, I mean, in our world and culture, rather than trying to go back to the Hebrew, or even focusing on the Greek rather than going back to the Hebrew. But basically, they would be responding the same way you are, Baruch. They just want to deal with the text. But that's a Protestant, definitely a Protestant approach. One of the things that Jews and Catholics share is a tradition of digging into the text and looking for hints and drawing wisdom,
Yes,
or information
that's
out of
it.
slight hints in the text.
That's it. That's right. Exactly right.
Okay, Alan.
I was just going to add what I think it may not be a universal practice of midrash, but in your example about Moses and how God made his decision, it conveys a lesson too about how to treat other people. So it's not just that he picked a guy to run the ship. This guy is the kind of person that is a
Right.
good model for us to have, and that goes for Abraham and probably other. But I don't know if that's always a universal part of the midrash that's trying to fill in the blanks. But these two examples come to mind.
No, I mean, there's a lot of midrash, including this midrash about the women cutting their hands.
Yeah,
You know, I
exactly.
don't know that teaches us how to.
Yeah, no. Therefore, I'll withdraw the word.
So midrash goes far afield. It's an extensive literature. I think people enjoy it and love it, and you know, there's lots of collections of midrash, you know, that are wonderful to read, and they just dig in and explore more and more of the text, and it's something
So that's midrash with a capital M, but I've heard people like this conversation we're having when we created an interpretation of something that isn't in the text, we've created our own, contemporary midrash too, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Exactly.
what I would say is, if we were being very specific, the term midrash should only refer to something that you can actually track into the text as a word or a hint in the text. That, because midrash means to draw out. To draw out, you have to start with something there. We can come up with far-fetched biblical interpretation,
Right.
and I would just call that biblical interpretation. Technically, I wouldn't call it midrash, but I wouldn't worry about, you know, the terminology so much. When we study Torah, you know, on a Saturday morning, we read a phrase, and people are coming up with their own interpretations and their guesses, and about how can this possibly be, and you know what really happened. Some of it might technically be midrash, and some of it, you know, just might be their own far-fetched interpretation. Okay, so I'm glad we had a chance to flesh that out. I hope it always sort of amazes me that you guys keep coming back and listening to this stuff. I must admit, I enjoy discussing it, and I find this world fascinating.
Well,
Yeah.
let me just add that in addition to learning from you, one of the fun things of groups like this is we learn from each other.
Yes.
Both the questions and the experiences that we have.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, and particularly when we have folks that have grown up in other cultures like Farah. You know, you grow up in a different world in Persia, and you learn different things. I mean, it's one of the joys of my married life, is that my wife grew up in Casablanca, and her take on so many things is, you know, very, very different than my own take.
When will be the next meeting?
The next what?
The next meeting, the next time Zoom.
We meet every Monday night and every Wednesday night. Did you get an email from me?
No, I didn't get you. Only just my son gave me.
Okay, so Farah,
Yes.
you can, if you want, you can. I'm going to stop recording.